So we're going to be in Genesis chapter 18. We're going to be looking at the story of Abraham and Lot and Sodom and Gomorrah. And so I think it's helpful to kind of think of these three characters. We're going to make the city of Sodom kind of a character here. But you have Abraham, who is a flawed but faithful servant of God. And here we're going to see him really walking in his obedience to God. And then we're going to have his nephew, Lot, who has faith in God but is conflicted in the way that he acts. And then we have this city of Sodom and its residents who symbolize and embody just the wickedness of the world. And Lot is kind of between these two places. He's between Abraham and he's between Sodom. So if you kind of remember Abraham's journey, let me just kind of back up. Abraham is in the city of Ur. I know you guys are all familiar. You're picturing it on your last vacation. And God calls him to leave Ur, to go to this land that he's going to promise him. And along this journey, God continues to reveal that Abraham is going to be the center of God's plan to bless the whole world, the nations. And so Abraham is journeying through this part of the world. And it's not like there aren't other cities and countries and nations at this time. There's Egypt, this great power, and there's these other tribes and these other countries. And Abraham is constantly kind of trying to figure out where he fits in this world. And the temptation, I think, for Abraham, and especially we see here for Lot, is to always want to go and fit in with these other nations that God has not called him to be a part of. And so we're going to see that God here in this particular passage is calling us, as we see the story of Abraham and Lot, he's calling us to reject these cities of man, as I think of them, these wicked places, these places where sin has taken hold of, and rather we're supposed to flee those places so that we can find our life in the promised land that God has for us. So the first thing we're going to look at is we're going to look at Abraham, this righteous individual, and how he intercedes for this wicked city of Sodom. Look at verse 16 of chapter 18 in the book of Genesis. We're going to read through verse 22 right now. It says this: Then the men set out from there. These are these visitors that had come to Abraham last week. This is God and these angelic messengers that came last week. Like I said, if you missed the sermon, you can watch it online. It's quite a doozy. And they looked down toward Sodom, and Abraham went with them to set them on their way. The Lord said, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? Seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him. For I have chosen him that he may command his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he has promised him." Then the Lord said, "Because the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great and their sin is very grave, I will go down to see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry that has come to me. And if not, I will know." So the men turned from there and went toward Sodom, but Abraham still stood before the Lord. So what we see here is we see Abraham, having had the covenant of God just recently refreshed in his mind. The promises of God have been brought clear to him. There's still some lessons he's going to have to go through, some stumbles that he's going to have to walk into, some testing that he's going to have to go through. But he, in this moment, is kind of walking directly in the obedience that he's found in God, that God has promised him that God would make him a great nation and he would bring out of him the blessing to all nations through his descendants, specifically through a son. That God has chosen Abraham to be a father of a great nation. Now, this is kind of a big deal for Abraham because at this point, him and his wife Sarah haven't been able to have a child. And so he's walking in a promise that has yet to fully be realized in his life, but he's doing that. And so he's inviting Abraham in this moment to know and participate in what he's going to do, right? He's saying, should I tell Abraham what's going to happen to this city of Sodom, or should I hide it from him? Because he has made this covenant to Abraham, he's inviting him to know this. He's going to tell him what's going to happen, that the wickedness of this city has come up to him and that he's going to judge them. This idea, this picture of the wickedness, the injustice of Sodom and Gomorrah coming up to God is a particularly powerful image. It sounds very similar to what happened earlier in this same book when Cain killed his brother Abel, and it talked about his blood crying out from the ground. Right? It's like this injustice is like a voice that is shouting to God. I think sometimes when we look at the world around us and we see it, we see all of its problems and we see all of the injustices and all of the oppression and all of the brokenness, and we wonder, does God hear that? He does, right? Here he hears it. It comes up to him. This city of Sodom and this city of Gomorrah are evidence of a society that has been broken, where unrighteousness is the norm and injustice is what people experience daily. But God notices it. Now, this is important. Not only does God notice our sin, it's good that he notices sin. See, a lot of times, if you're like me, you want God to see the sin of other people, but maybe like overlook my sin, right? We want mercy for ourselves and judgment for others. That's not the way it works. Because of who God is, he sees all sin. We don't want God to ignore sin, because if he ignores our sin, then that means he's going to ignore other sin. And if any sin goes unpunished, then it diminishes the truth of God's character. If God could overlook any sin, then he wouldn't be fully just, and we want a just God. You know, none of us want to be punished for our sin, but here's the truth. When we see injustice, we want God to act. We want God to punish wickedness. And so what a lot of us would do is we'd be like, okay, God, could you just like punish the really bad stuff? Like genocide, please, punish the people who commit that. Or child abuse, yes, but don't punish my pride or my selfishness or these small things we think that we commit. But that's not how it works. This is important for us to understand. Not every sin has equal consequences in this world. I think that's pretty self-evident. Like, I would much rather you lie to me than murder me. Right? We agree? I think most of us should agree on that. If not, we need to talk afterward. Right? We understand that there are different impacts of sin across human relationships. And we understand that some sins are worse than others in that sense. But compared to God, every sin is infinitely bad because he's infinitely holy. Right? If God only punished what we consider to be the worst sins, then he would only be 95% holy or 90% holy. Then he wouldn't be perfect and he wouldn't be God. In heaven, there's not going to be like, well, just the little sins sneak in. All of it has to be dealt with, whether small or great, because it's a violation of his commands, of his character, and of his creation. And here's the beauty of it. Because God sees all sins and all wickedness, he promises that he's going to deal with all of it. That he's going to punish all the wicked and he's going to reward all the righteous. Now, this is going to sort of leading us into what does it mean to be righteous and what does it mean to be wicked and how do we receive God's mercy if we are wicked. But I think it is also helpful, just as we walk into this, to also define maybe a basic term that you're going to hear, and that is the term sin. Now, if you've been to church at all, you hear the word sin, but I think a lot of us fill in the blanks what we think sin really is. You know, and there's a lot of angles that you can look at the term sin in the Bible, right? We can think of sin as a standard, as a failure to live up to God's standard. You know, sin is anything we think, say, do, or believe that violates God's commands. But sin, in another sense, I think, is just simply rejecting God as ruler of all things. In the book of Romans, in the very first chapter, the Apostle Paul describes sin as idolatry. Now, what is idolatry? Idolatry is worshiping something that is not God in the place of God. Idolatry is elevating something to the place of God that can't be in that place. It's worshiping the creature rather than the creator. And so when I think about it, when I go, okay, what does that look like in our modern world. If I had to sort of describe what does sin, maybe the core of sin, look like in our modern world, I would say the core of sin in our modern world is we have put ourselves as God. We have sort of said, I am the one who defines all of my reality. That I sit on the throne of my own life. And so a sin is not what God says a sin is. A sin is if you hurt me. And I'm sinning if I fail to find who I'm supposed to be. That I'm the center of my own world. So when God tells us to love him and love our neighbors, most people that I talk to are trying to find out how to love themselves. So that we've kind of been at the center of it all. And so when God comes in and says, that is not according to my commands or my character or my righteousness, we say, who cares? And the result is that we are separated from God. Now, this is a major problem. If I'm the standard of righteousness, then that is a real problem. Because number one, I'm not sufficient to save myself. If I'm being honest, I'm not truly righteous. I know the wickedness in my heart. But also, then I become the standard by which I judge other people. So then righteousness kind of moves on a sliding scale of what I don't like or what I don't prefer. And so if I feel a certain way, then that has to be the right way. You'll hear people say, well, do what feels right. I don't know if you know this, your feelings are wrong sometimes. In fact, sometimes your feelings don't need to be satisfied, they need to be crucified. It is actually possible, if you think about it, to realize that you're a sinner, that you have a desire or a proclivity toward a certain sin that you really love and you really want to participate in, and you can agree that it is wrong. That if God says it's wrong, how you feel about it doesn't really matter. So here we have the city of Sodom and the city of Gomorrah, and their wickedness, this cry of wickedness, has come up to God. And it says that he comes down to the city to investigate. He goes down to this city. So I live just a block away from here, and my office and my house is on the third floor of our house. And I have 3 kids under the age of 9. And every now and then I'll be in my office and I'll hear chaos. And I'll say, don't make me come down there. Which is just me hoping they'll stop so I don't actually have to go all the way down the stairs, because then I have to catch my breath when I come back up. But right, if I have to come figure out what's going on, I'm going to investigate, and I'm going to bring order to this chaos. Here we see that God is going to come down and investigate for himself. We live in a world with imperfect juries and imperfect judges, systems of justice that get things wrong because people are flawed and they see what they want to see based on their experience. We are finite, we are sinful, we don't get things right. I don't think that's very complicated. But here we see God, the perfect God, who sees everything and knows everything and has no flaw in his character. He is going to come and judge. And so as he's going this way towards Sodom, look at verse 23. It says this, then Abraham drew near and said, will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? Suppose there are 50 righteous within the city. Will you then sweep away the place and not spare it for the 50 righteous who are in it? Far be it for you to do such a thing, to put the righteous to death with the wicked, so that the righteous fare as the wicked. Far be that from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just? And the Lord said, if I find at Sodom 50 righteous in the city, I will spare the whole place for their sake. Then Abraham thinks about it. Verse 27, Abraham answered and said, behold, I have undertaken to speak to the Lord, I who am but dust and ashes. Suppose 5 of the 50 righteous are lacking. Will you destroy the whole city for lack of 5? And he said, I will not destroy it if I find 45 there. Again, he spoke to him and said, suppose 40 are found there. He answered, for the sake of 40, I will not do it. Then he said, oh, let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak. Suppose 30 are found there. He answered, I will not do it if I find 30 there. I think you get the pattern. Verse 31, he said, behold, I have undertaken to speak to the Lord. Suppose 20 are found there. He answered, for the sake of 20, I will not destroy it. Then he said, oh, let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak again, but this once. Suppose 10 are found there. He answered, for the sake of 10, I will not destroy it. And the Lord went his way when he had finished speaking to Abraham, and Abraham returned to his place. I think we have a moment to learn from Abraham here. There's a sort of a funny scene in my mind, right? Abraham's like, okay, God, you don't need to destroy these people. You're a righteous God, but you would never destroy those who are righteous. So in this giant city, what if there's 50 righteous? Okay, maybe I spoke too soon, God. What about 45? Okay, 40, 35, 30, 25, 20 years sold, right? It's like he's haggling with God. He's bargaining. And I think some of us can look at that and think, okay, Abraham, what are you doing? You know that this place is wicked. I think Abraham is a really helpful picture here, because what he's doing is he's trying to figure out how this city can be saved. Now, Abraham has actually interceded on behalf of Sodom and his nephew Lot before. We're going to meet Lot in a second. Back in chapters 13 and 14, actually, his nephew Lot and him had separated, kind of gone their own ways to build their own homesteads. And Lot kind of went toward the city of Sodom and Gomorrah, and then he kind of inched closer and closer. Before long, he's living in the city of Sodom. And then there's this great regional battle, and the city of Sodom gets overtaken and Lot gets captured. And so Abraham in his 70s, I know you probably think of Abraham as old and feeble, but you got to think of just a jacked 70-year-old man with an army of 300. He goes and just wins the battle and captures his nephew Lot back, or frees his nephew Lot and frees the city of Sodom. He wins here. He's interceded for them as a military hero. He saved them physically from destruction. And so now when we fast forward to this scene, we see him spiritually interceding for others. He's thinking of their salvation, not his own. He's begging God to rescue them, not himself. When I see that, I have to be encouraged or maybe convicted. How often do we see the wickedness of others, and are we compelled to go to God to ask for their salvation, to go to God and ask for their rescue? How many of us are persistent enough to ask God that he would save some? And so when I look at Abraham, yes, he is probably not going about this the best way, but I love how he is having this conversation with God, feeling his way forward in faith, trying to find a way that God would rescue these people. He doesn't question the justice of God. He's just trying to find a way for God to spare the righteous in that city. And I love how God doesn't get mad at him. Do you ever think that you go to God and you ask too many questions, and maybe they're dumb questions, like maybe this is a dumb question, and you think, well, God must be tired of all of my dumb questions? He's not. He can handle it. Do you ever go to God a little angry or upset, and you think he must be annoyed with you? He's not. He can handle it. He can start the conversation. He can end the conversation when he wants. He's happy for us to come with him. And I wonder what it would look like for me if, even imperfectly, if I was interceding for the wicked of my city. Let's move on to chapter 19. We're going to see how Lot is entangled in this city. Let's look at the first couple of verses. In verse 1 of chapter 19, it says, the two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed himself with his face to the earth and said, my lords, please turn aside to your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet. Then you may rise up early and go on your way. They said, no, we will spend the night in the town square. But he pressed them strongly, so they turned aside to him and entered his house, and he made them a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. So the scene shifts to the city of Sodom. These angelic messengers have come down to investigate this city. And we see Abraham's nephew, who's already showed up earlier in the book of Genesis. His name is Lot, and he's sitting in the gate of Sodom. Now, this is important, I think. I mentioned previously that Lot had separated from his uncle Abraham. He had moved toward the city of Sodom. Eventually, he began living in the city of Sodom, but now we see that he's sitting at the gate in Sodom. But what that means is he's a person of influence in that city. He's attained some level of influence. He's a man of standing in this city. He's gone from living near it to living in it to now being in a position of leadership in this notoriously wicked city. He should have never been in or near it, much less sitting at the gate. And we're going to see why that was foolish in a few minutes. So these strangers show up, and Lot shows them hospitality. This sort of connects him to his uncle Abraham, who when these strangers showed up to Abraham, he showed them hospitality as well. But Abraham's hospitality seemed to be much more extravagant than Lot's. Lot seems a little more subdued in his hospitality. Right? Abraham, he went and was running around, like I said, in his 70s. He's running around in the heat of the day. He kills a fatted calf. He bakes them all this bread, or has his wife Sarah bake them all this bread, and then he stands and serves them. Lot is hospitable to them, but his bread is unleavened, right? Seems like he's in a little bit of a rush. He doesn't have time for the bread to rise. And he seems to say that they can leave early in the morning, almost like, hey, you can stay, then you can go. You probably don't need to hang around this city long, and especially don't go stay in the town square. It's not safe. So Lot kind of is continually portrayed as someone who's like his uncle Abraham in his righteousness, but not to the same level. Like he's mixed in with wickedness. Like his life is more complicated than that. He's in this in-between space of sin and salvation. Verse 4, it says, but before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man, let me say that again, all the people to the last man, surrounded the house, and they called to Lot, where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us, that we may know them. Lot went out to the men at the entrance, shut the door after him, and said, I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Behold, I have 2 daughters who have not known any man. Let me bring them out to you and do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof. But they said, stand back. And they said, this fellow came to sojourn, and he has become the judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them. Then they pressed hard against the man Lot and drew near to break the door down. But the men reached out their hands and brought Lot into the house with them and shut the door. And they struck with blindness the men who were at the entrance of the house, both small and great, so that they wore themselves out, groping for the door. So if the question of just how wicked Sodom is was still up for debate, I don't think it's up for debate much longer. This is how wicked this city is. With a barely concealed euphemism, these men come to Lot demanding to rape his visitors. In fact, history has branded them as sinful ever since. Now some scholars, to be fair, have argued that their sin is somehow not related to their homosexuality, and I don't think that's necessarily at the top of the problem. That's just the evidence of their wicked hearts, right? This is a violent place to be. But I also think that too often in our modern world, as Christians, for fear that we're going to offend our gay friends or neighbors, we're afraid to say what the Bible says, that homosexuality is sinful, that it is not God's design, that it is not good for us. But here, it's clear that one of the evidences of their sinfulness is that they are trying to harm these men, and they are acting out in clearly sinful ways. Now, I grew up in a world, in a kind of Christian culture that was probably unhelpfully and harmfully discussed homosexuality. Right? We kind of viewed it as like a worse sin than other sins. And we kind of made people feel like gross and outcast if that was where they were coming from. I don't think that's helpful for us. But I think the pendulum has swung pretty far, at least in my lifetime. The Bible's clear from the Old Testament to the New Testament that this is sinful, right? That homosexuality is a sin. And it's a bad sin, but it's a sin just like all these other sins that it's listed alongside. It's a sin along with other kinds of sexual immorality, along with theft and slander and greed and disobedience and gossip. And I think the picture in Sodom and Gomorrah is that they are just wicked through and through. That their whole world is upside down. The way that God created the world to be has so fallen apart in their culture that it is undeniable. In fact, I think that's the picture you see in Romans 1. If you were to read Romans 1, and you were to read what it looks like when people reject God and place themselves on a pedestal, when they put the creature above the creator, you would be reading the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. It would be a summary of what sin does. Sin ruins everything. And so when we get to this story of Sodom and Gomorrah, we're left with no doubt concerning the depravity of Sodom. What does it say? The whole city is involved. Both young and old, all the people to the last man surrounded the house. Abraham said if there are 10 righteous, there's not 10 righteous. There's no righteousness left here. So Lot, he comes out, and this is where we see Lot. He's kind of in this middle ground. He's not Abraham, but he's not the residents of Sodom either. He comes out and he tries to protect his guests. He puts himself between them. He shuts the door behind him. He tries to appeal to these men. Remember, he's a man of standing. He was the one who was sitting in the gate. He calls them brothers. He says, brothers, please don't do this. Don't act wickedly. Now, he thought that he had earned the right to their respect. He'd lived among them. He'd become a leader in their town. Did it work? No. As soon as he tries to go against their sin, they say, you are no longer our brother. You're a foreigner. You're a sojourner, and you want to judge us? I think sometimes we do this, right? We think, well, I can kind of cozy up to sin and I can get respectability in the world, and then I'm going to be the one who convinces all these people of what is right. And it doesn't often work. Now, when that doesn't work, he does something that is unconscionable. He offers them his daughters. Now, there's a huge gap in culture. There's a huge gap in time. We know how women were viewed in this day and age in the ancient Near East. They were viewed as property to have children, which is one of the reasons the Bible is such a revolutionary book, because of the way it elevates women. But Lot does something that I can't even imagine saying or doing, and I don't know why he does it. It's certainly, if you continue reading the rest of this chapter, which we probably won't get to, how he treats his daughters comes back on him by the way that they treat him. But he does something that I couldn't even imagine doing. I don't know why he does it. And this is kind of who Lot is. He's sort of righteous in moments and unrighteous in other moments. He's caught in this web of problems. He knows better, unlike the residents of Sodom. But it seems for a moment that he is reasoning with the people of Sodom in the way that they would think and act. He's bargaining with behavior that shows he's deeply ingrained in the wickedness of this city. You know, when you reason sinfully with sinners, the outcome is always dreadful. His status in the city doesn't work. It was false. His position was not the same thing as real influence and power. So he's jeopardized his daughters, he's enraged his townsmen, and now he's about to be assaulted himself, right? They're gonna really go after him. They're gonna do worse to him than they promised to do to his visitors. And so Lot goes from being the one who's trying to rescue them to the one who needs to be rescued. So we see these angelic visitors pull him inside. They protect him. It really clarifies what's going on. Lot is not the hero. He is the one who needs rescuing. He's the one who needs protection. And so these angels, they supernaturally blind the mob. And so if it was you or me, we would think, okay, I just got blinded along with all of my townsmen by these angels. Maybe I should give up and go home, right? Now, okay, we lost, let's go. But what does it say? It says, they continued to wear themselves out groping for the door. This is how wicked Sodom is. Even when they are blinded, they refuse to repent. I've heard someone say that hell is actually locked from the inside. The point they're trying to make is this: when you reject God, you don't just have a change of heart. When you go down that path of sin, you don't just change your mind. You have to be rescued from death to life. See, the difference between Sodom and the residents there and others is the willingness to see the end and repent. Right? Paul, the great persecutor of the church, what happened to him? He is out persecuting the church and he's blinded, very similar language, by an angel of the Lord. But the difference there is he repents. You know, when I work with people who are dealing with substance abuse problems, one of the phrases that's kind of made it into our cultural vocabulary is this idea of rock bottom. Right? They just have to hit their rock bottom. Once they hit their rock bottom, then they'll change. There's some truth to that. The problem is, some people's rock bottom is death. Right? You always wonder, I've dealt with this both in my family and other places. You always wonder, how much further can they go? Here, the residents of Sodom, when they are confronted by the angels of the Lord and they are blinded, they refuse to repent. The evidence of their evil is undeniable and the verdict is judgment. So let's look at that judgment and God's salvation. Look at verse 12. I'm going to read all the way through 38. It says, "Then the men said to Lot, 'Have you anyone else here, sons-in-law, sons, daughters, or anyone you have in the city? Bring them out of the place. For we are about to destroy this place because the outcry against its people has become great before the Lord. And the Lord has sent us to destroy it.' So Lot went out and said to his sons-in-law who were to marry his daughters, 'Up, get out of this place, for the Lord is about to destroy the city.' But he seemed to his sons-in-law to be jesting. As morning dawned, the angels urged Lot, saying, 'Up, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, lest you be swept away in the punishment of the city.' But he lingered. So the men seized him and his wife and his 2 daughters by the hand, the Lord being merciful to him. And they brought him out and set him outside the city. And as they brought them out, one said, 'Escape for your life. Do not look back or stop anywhere in the valley. Escape to the hills, lest you be swept away.' And Lot said to them, 'Oh no, my lords, behold, your servant has found favor in your sight, and you have shown me great kindness in saving my life. But I cannot escape to the hills, lest the disaster overtake me and I die. Behold, this city is near enough to flee to, and it's a little one. Let me escape there. Is it not a little one, and my life will be saved?' He said to him, 'Behold, I grant you this favor also, that I will not overthrow the city of which you have spoken. Escape there quickly, for I can do nothing till you arrive there.' Therefore, the name of the city was called Zoar. The sun had risen on the earth when Lot came to Zoar. Then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from the Lord out of heaven. And he overthrew these cities and all the valley and all the inhabitants of the cities and what grew on the ground. But Lot's wife behind him looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. And Abraham went early in the morning to the place where he had stood before the Lord. And he looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah and toward all the land of the valley. And he looked, and behold, the smoke of the land went up like the smoke of a furnace. So it was that when God destroyed the cities of the valley, God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow when he overthrew the cities in which Lot had lived." Lot is the picture of reluctant salvation. God's grace and mercy continue to pursue Lot. He's told that the city is going to be destroyed, and he tells his future sons-in-law, and they think he's joking. Now, I don't know why they think he's joking. I don't know if they think this is too crazy. Why would it happen? Or I kind of get the sense that maybe Lot, and the way he's telling it, makes them not believe it. That he has no urgency himself, because it describes later that when he's told to go, what does he do? He lingers. He hangs around. This place is going to be destroyed, and you're going to be caught up in that destruction, so you need to leave now. And what does he do? He sticks around. Isn't that a picture of how we treat our sin? We linger. We hang around it. We tell ourselves one day we'll move on. We stay in that relationship. We pause on that website. We loiter in that situation. We entertain that temptation when God has told us to flee. We linger. But the mercy of God is that while he lingered, these angels dragged him out by the hand. I can think of no greater picture of my own salvation than God dragged me out. Even sometimes when I wanted to hang around for my own destruction. But Lot continues to maintain this reluctant attitude, right? God says, go to the hills, go to the caves, which, by the way, he ends up in later on past what we're going to look at tonight. But he's not a country boy. He needs to go to the city. So God, I won't go to the big city, but maybe this small city you can let me go to. You just get the sense that Lot still doesn't fully get it. And then we see his wife. As bad as the judgment might be on Lot, hers is worse. And the way it describes it here is that she looks back and she became a pillar of salt. She was told not to look back. If you read the Gospel of Luke, it tells us a little more about what that means. It says, just as it was in the days of Lot, they were eating and drinking, buying and selling, planting and building. But on the day when Lot went out of Sodom, fire and sulfur rained from heaven and destroyed them all. So will it be on the day when the Son of Man is revealed. On that day, let the one who is on the housetop with his goods in the house not come down to take them away. And likewise, let the one who is in the field not turn back. Remember Lot's wife. Whoever seeks to preserve his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life will keep it. Obedience to Christ and salvation demand we flee from sin and judgment. Too often, we want the salvation of God while holding on to our old life. We want to have residence in the sinful, wicked city while also receiving the salvation of God. Maybe you're like Lot's wife here right now. That God's called you out of sin. He's called you to new life in him, but you're tempted to look back, to gaze, to reminisce, to remember. Don't look back. Don't look back. Nothing in that old life is worth preserving. It is only destruction. God calls us to look forward, to fix our eyes on Jesus. You and I aren't truly trusting and obeying God if we are holding on to our desire for the world. So what can we learn from this? I sort of have three things I want to end with just to kind of help bring this home. I know it's a long sermon because it's a lot of text and a lot of stuff to go through. There's a lot of lessons we can learn. So I've just sort of boiled it down to three things, but it gets a little complicated with the way the New Testament describes Lot. Especially the Apostle Peter. He's really ruined this sermon for me this week. He's really messed it up for me, and you'll see why in a second. So I'm going to be reading a little bit out of 2 Peter chapter 2. But the first thing that I think we can see from this is sin is serious and judgment is real. 2 Peter chapter 2, the Apostle Peter writes, "For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept until the judgment, if he did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a herald of righteousness, with 7 others, when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly, if by turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to ashes, he condemned them to extinction, making them an example of what is going to happen to the ungodly." I know we want to think of only the positive aspects of our salvation. And for those of us who are in Christ, there is no fear here. But it is true that sin leads to destruction. Sin is real and so are its consequences. And the problem with the judgment of God is it comes swiftly to where you can't prepare. See, a lot of people think, well, when I see it coming, then I'll change. Or to put it more in sort of what I hear from college students when I talk to them, it's, okay, when I get a little bit older and get a little more settled, then I'll deal with this. You don't know. It comes suddenly and swiftly. Sin is serious and judgment is real. But we see that God rescues those who trust in him. Look at verse 7 of 2 Peter 2. It says, "And if he rescued righteous Lot, greatly distressed by the sensual conduct of the wicked, for as that righteous man lived among them day after day, he was tormenting his righteous soul over the lawless deeds that he saw and heard. Then the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from trials and to keep the unrighteous under punishment until the day of judgment, and especially those who indulge in the lust of defiling passion and despise authority. This is where Peter's ruined it for me. Like, could he have said righteous Lot more times? Is it possible? I mean, I read the Genesis passage. Did you read the Genesis passage? Would you have said Lot righteous? Probably not me. If I'm being honest, maybe you read the Bible more like Peter, less like me. If so, good for you. Something in Peter's understanding of Lot's rescue proves to him that Lot is righteous. Now, we do see that Lot isn't as wicked as the people of Sodom. He does see their sin and want to stop it. There's some righteousness there. But ultimately, the way we know that Lot is righteous is because Abraham says, God, do not destroy the righteous, and Lot lives. Because Lot lives, that's how we know that he is righteous. In fact, the rescue of Lot proves that he is righteous. The question is, how could anyone consider Lot to be righteous? Even though Abraham is held up as the more obedient and faithful servant, right? It says that God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst. Something about Abraham's intercession seems to have led to Lot's salvation. But even though Abraham is held up as the more obedient and faithful servant, we've seen over and over in Genesis that Abraham is not perfect. He's had some real mistakes, like real mess ups. But the Bible repeatedly tells us this, that Abraham's faith was credited to him as righteousness. Abraham, a sinner, like all of us, a particularly bad sinner in a lot of ways, his faith was credited to him as righteousness. That God's righteousness that we see through Christ is given to Abraham because he believes in him. The same is true for Lot. See, it's not the size or strength of Lot's faith that saves him, but the size and strength of the God in whom he places his faith. The Reformation had this phrase that describes all people who are saved, and it says, at the same time, both justified and a sinner. At the same time, we are both righteous and sinners. How is that? In our flesh, we are sinners. But in Christ, God sees the righteousness of Jesus and gives it to us. Lot's rescue shows us the beauty of the gospel that God saves half-hearted, temptation-trapped, hesitant believers if they place their faith in him. And how does he do it? This is the part that I love the most. How does God save Lot? Does he sit outside of the city and say, Lot, when you get it together, you come find me? No, he goes into the city. He goes into Lot's house. He grabs him by the hand and he takes him to rescue. How do you and I come to faith in God? Our sin cries out to God, and he doesn't sit there on his throne in heaven and wait till we figure it out. No, he leaves his throne. He takes on flesh. He is born to show us the way to God. He dies on a cross, and he carries us to himself through his grace and his death and his resurrection. He drags us to himself. Sin is serious. Judgment is real. God rescues those who trust in him. But I do think it's important that to recognize that Lot is not a great example for us to follow. God still calls us to eager obedience, not distracted faith. I don't think any of us, looking back on our lives, want to get to heaven and have lived the life that Lot has lived. If you keep reading in this story, like I said, I'm not going to read it. You can read it before bed tonight just to really lift your spirits. Don't read it in a children's. I've never seen this in a children's Bible. I don't know why they skip these stories. They wait for the youth pastor to have to explain them years later. Lot does not end his life well. It does not go well for him. His legacy is not good. In fact, he becomes the father of two nations who are enemies of Israel, enemies who are particularly idolatrous, worshiping Baal and Molech, two false gods that are notorious in that part of the world at that time. The legacy he leaves, despite his rescue, is quite wicked. And so we should not walk in the way of Lot. We should not linger. We should not delay. We should not cozy up to the sinful things of the world. If we see anything in Lot, we can see the grace of God, and we should also see the warning of sin. I hate this idea that has gone around in our world that you have to learn things the hard way. You don't. God has given us instruction so you explicitly don't have to learn things the hard way. Now, you might end up learning things the hard way, but you don't have to. See, too often, I think many of us are like Lot. We're troubled by the sin we see around us in the world, but we end up responding to the sin we see around us by sinning ourselves. We end up participating in the ways of the world while at the same time disgusted by the world. God wants to call us away from that kind of life. God is calling us to reject the city of man. God is calling us to reject the wicked things of the world, to flee from judgment and find salvation in him through faith. And I think when we do that, we can be more like Abraham and less like Lot, where we can be looking out at our city that is broken, that is wicked, that is hurting. And instead of participating in the wickedness, we can intercede on behalf of it. We can go to God with desperate, persistent prayers, asking for him to save some. Rather than looking back and longing like Lot's wife did, we can look with compassion and hope that God would save.